Good morning, everybody. Today's proceedings will be live streamed after the usual 15-minute delay. Those with mobile telephones may use them to report what they hear in the hearing room, but only after 15 minutes have elapsed since the event that they're reporting. They may not be used for recording or photography. May the witness be sworn, please. Thank you.
Please stand.
Thank you.
Please repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Please, can you state your full name?
Yes, Jonathan Michael Boutcher, known as Jon Boutcher.
Thank you. Your witness statement is behind tab A1. It's UCPI 39425, dated the 2nd of November 2025. I think you wanted to make a couple of points of clarification to that witness statement in relation to paragraph 350. It refers to an estimated start date in your post in line management of the SDS of October 2007.
That's correct.
However, earlier in the statement, you state that it would have been in and around September 2007, and now, having read additional documents, you're of the view that it was probably around August, September that you were appointed to that post.
That's correct, sir, yes. Thank you.
Paragraph 506 reads SO13 and SO13, which should state SO12 and SO13.
That's correct.
And at paragraph 608, within the quotation SD, it should read SDS.
And that's correct too. Thank you.
Other than those amendments, are the contents of your witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Mr. Boutcher, you've made this your first statement in relation to your dealings with the SDS, but I understand that you have made two further witness statements in relation to your later dealings with undercover policing.
I did make later statements, yes.
And those will be dealt with in T5 of this inquiry.
That's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. You'd like to say a few words before you start your evidence, is that
Yes,
right?
please, with the Chair's permission.
Of course.
Thank you, sir. So I did want to make some opening remarks in light of having read documents made available to me and having recently followed this inquiry, watching various testimonies. I make these comments as a previous National Police Chiefs Council lead for undercover policing and also as a serving Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, a role which gives me responsibility for authorising the most intrusive of covert tactics available to policing. I speak for myself and no other participant to this inquiry. I am appalled by what I now know about the activities of the SDS and the gross misconduct of so many of its officers. Their abusive and inappropriate behaviour that expose members of the public to unacceptable harm. I know we will shortly come to the events of 2007 when I became the Detective Chief Superintendent responsible for the SDS and made the decision to close it down. At the time of my appointment, I had concerns about the legal justification for the unit's existing deployments, its intrusion into people's private lives, and the high likelihood that its officers, deployed for very long periods, would end up encouraging and inciting criminal acts which would not otherwise have been committed. The SDS intelligence model for operational deployments, their poor planning and supervision, and the lack of meaningful oversight all caused me huge concerns. I did not know then what I now know about the sexual abuse of many women, many vulnerable women, by some SDS operatives, and the incalculable and intolerable harm that caused, including in one case, the fathering and abandoning of a child. In my judgment, most of the groups they were infiltrating presented no threat to public order, let alone democracy. Yet at that time, society faced an increasing and enduring threat from international terrorism, from which people were losing their lives, whilst almost no undercover capability existed to infiltrate those dangerous terrorist groups. The failures by so many SDS officers at each and every rank, and the many acts of wrongdoing uncovered by this inquiry, and the activists and journalists who brought it about, represent a major failing in undercover policing. Not all operatives acted badly, and the psychological impact on them and their families from these long-term deployments will have been devastating. From my following of this critically important inquiry, I also now understand that much of the abuse and misconduct committed by SDS operatives was known to senior special branch officers over a protracted period of time. The absence of leadership from many senior special branch officers over so many years is just as damning as the failures of those beneath them. Indeed, this episode represents perhaps the most significant failure of leadership in my 40 years of a policing career. Our senior police leaders of today would do well to learn from this inquiry. The testimony of victims should be part of this. The SDS should have been closed down many years before I took the decision to bring it to an end. So much has been done to prevent such behaviours happening again, not least through the work of this inquiry. I anticipate detailed evidence of this will be presented to the inquiry in future sessions. I want to reassure the public that things have changed significantly and that the undercover tactic is now used safely and lawfully. The behaviours the inquirers uncovered within the SDS were not representative of wider policing as I've experienced it, and I'm deeply sorry that they occurred. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Then, looking at your background and experience as set out in large part in your witness statement, you joined the MPS as a PC in 1984.
That's correct.
Would you have been around the age of 18 at that stage?
18 and a half, yeah.
You went back to Derbyshire, where you had grown up as an officer, in 1987 to 1988 for a year, but found that a bit too quiet for your liking, and moved back to the MPS in 1991, joining the CID in Kennington. Is that right?
That's correct.
Then in 1993, you were promoted to detective sergeant and appointed to Brixton Police Station, where you were working in the CID and leading Op Vulgan, which was to do with guns and drugs, working with SO10, the Central Undercover Unit.
That's right, yes.
Were you there when Stephen Lawrence was murdered and Dwayne Brooks attacked on the 22nd of April 1993?
I think I'd just arrived actually at Brixton around about that time, yeah.
Did you know of the family campaign that sought justice for Stephen following that attack?
Only what I would have seen in the time in the media.
Were you involved in any capacity with the investigation or with any of the intelligence gathering around that campaign?
I was not, no.
Did you know of the political campaigning in the area at the time? We obviously had Welling in the October 1993.
Yeah, I have some memory of activity that was happening, but through the media. I was very much focused on crime undercover operations around getting guns and drugs off the street, so I wasn't involved in the actual policing of any of those issues or any intelligence gathering.
Were you familiar at all with some of the political groups that were operating in the area at the time, such as Movement for Justice?
I wasn't, no.
The AFA?
No.
SWP?
No.
Black Panther?
No.
YRE?
No, I'm sorry.
Or NMP?
No.
Were you ever asked to provide any intelligence about those groups or the Stephen Lawrence campaign?
I've never been asked to do that.
Were you ever contacted by Special Branch in relation to what was happening in Brixton around that time?
I was not, no, never contacted by Special Branch at that time.
In 1996, you moved to the Regional Crime Squad, which later became known as the National Crime Squad. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And at paragraph 11 of your witness statement, you say that around 2000 you attended the National Undercover Training and Assessment course, the NUTAC course.
That's correct.
And what was your experience in relation to that? What did it involve and what was the purpose of it? Very briefly, if you don't mind.
I attended the course as a student. It was, to my recollection, a 2-week course, scenario-based, legal inputs, lots of testing of resilience. There was input on ethics. There was input on agent provocateur. There were stated cases at the time that, if you like, legally managed undercover operations, RV Christow and other cases, and the officers involved in those cases would come and speak to the course around their experiences. It was an assessed course, and at the end of it, you either passed or failed. It had a high attrition rate, traditionally. Normally, it would also involve a couple of students from overseas would be involved in the course, and I was successful in that course.
You talk about the legal input. Did that include reference to RIPA?
Not at that stage, no. It was pre-RIPA.
Okay. Around 2000?
No, so I did the course before then. I was on the course before RIPA had come in.
Okay. What about reference to the Human Rights Act?
Yeah, so there was all considerations around cases that had already occurred involving the deployment of the undercover tactic, around legal responsibilities of the operatives, management of the operations, issues around collateral intrusion. So what stated cases currently existed that provided the legal framework for undercover, we were required to study and understand.
And in terms of both the legal input and also the scenarios, was sex ever addressed in terms of the legal and ethical considerations around having sex in your undercover identity?
Yeah, I can very clearly, unequivocally say that it was made abundantly clear that any such relationships were not permitted, and rightly so.
And how was that communicated through the course?
It was, I can't remember the detail, but it was part of the training where around the ethics and values of what you did and how you conducted yourselves and how you would have to deal with any approaches, which I can talk more about if required.
How was that received by the students on the course?
Absolutely accepted, and I would have said all the students would have been absolutely in agreement with the way that was presented.
Did you know Frankie Flood at that time?
I did.
And did you know whether he was involved in developing the National Undercover Training and Assessment course?
He was at the course that I attended.
Did you hear anything, not necessarily just at the time, but subsequently, about the NUTAC course not being appropriate for the SDS undercover operatives?
So at that time, I don't think I knew anything about the SDS or its existence.
And subsequently, have you come to learn that the NUTAC course was seen to be inappropriate for the SDS operatives? And I'm thinking in particular in relation to HN773, who will be on your cipher list if you need it. But he assessed the NUTAC course in the early 1990s and thought that it was not relevant for the purposes of SDS operations.
So I have been made aware of that. I refer to it in my witness statement, and I would disagree with that position.
And why is that?
Because it's an assessed course, I give a lot of reasons in my statement with regards to my rationale when I became the Detective Chief Superintendent, that I sought for the operatives to go on the course. I thought it was nationally accredited training. it was proper assessments, there was scenarios, there was legal input. And I think it's around about paragraph 680 of my statement. I set out my concerns about the SDS training that I was aware of that occurred, if I can say in-house, in comparison to the NUTAC course. And I will say this, and it's evidence that I may probably be asked about in a future tranche of this inquiry. I had concerns about the NUTAC course. There needed to be developments to that course. But it was by far a better training framework than the in-house training that the SDS provided, in my judgment.
Can I bring up, please, B47, MPS 0527612 at page 2, please? We can see that by February 2007, a former SDS UCO had written a report about the suitability of the NUTAC course for SO15 SDS officers.
Yes.
Is this a document that you would have been familiar with when you took over your role in September 2007?
So it's dated the 2nd of February. I think it predates me taking over as the Detective Chief Superintendent, and I don't recall seeing the document before. Obviously, it's a very long time ago, so I can't assist you with any recall of the document. But I would have been an advocate for assessed training for undercover operatives.
We can see at page 5, in relation to the conclusion, so the last paragraph there, it suggested that about 40% of the syllabus would be relevant for SDS operatives. I'll just give you a moment to read that.
Yes.
And there was some consideration given to the prospect of developing a similar course, or this course, for SDS or counter-terrorism undercover work. Was that something that you were given any consideration to when you took over in August, September 2007?
I think because of what I learnt quite quickly about the in-house nature of the training for those operatives, the NUTAC course seemed to me to be the natural and progressive step for operatives with regards to their suitability and their training to be undercover officers. As I've said, and it's something I did a few years later, we then very much developed the NUTAC course into a College of Police-led course with national accreditation again through the college. I think at that stage, I don't recall any discussions about having, if the question is a fused course, if you will, it was to get those operatives onto the NUTAC course as a starting position.
And when you say you later looked at the course, was that when you were looking at training inputs to Chief Constables in 2016, when you were chair of the National Undercover Working Group?
I think it was before then, actually. It was around about 2014, 2015, I started to introduce the College of Policing to look at the NUTAC course, to do its own assessment of it as an independent body, and to see how we could improve the training and ensure that there was a process of ongoing assessments of undercover officers and licensing of the officers and of undercover units.
And was Frankie Flood involved in that with you at the time?
He was. So I was the chair then of the National Undercover Working Group as the chief officer lead for undercover policing, and Frankie effectively operated as the secretariat. He did most of the work.
At paragraph 12 of your witness statement, you make reference to the case of R against P and others, the 2001 case about telephone intercept evidence and covert tactics. And you say you were responsible for authorisation processes and ongoing reviews of those authorities for updating senior officers. And in that respect, you were accustomed to applying tests of necessity and proportionality in terms of justifying undercover operations.
That's correct, yes, I was.
And so, despite RIPA coming into force after you had done the NUTAC course, you were nevertheless familiar with the principles of necessity, proportionality and lawfulness.
Yeah, we had the Police Act in 97, Human Rights Act in 98. There was a direction of travel around the legal framework from some of the stated cases that I've alluded to, around the proper conduct of undercover operatives and operations. So, yes.
And how did your role in terms of authorisation change with the introduction of RIPA?
So, when RIPA came in, I would have been moving between was then the National Crime Squad and the Flying Squad. So I was a senior investigating officer, and I was utilising the various covert tactics available in dealing with the most challenging criminals that we face. So I would have been extremely familiar with getting authorisations from chief officers, providing the rationale, providing them with updates around ongoing operations where we had such intrusive covert authorities in place. So I was very familiar with the management of those types of operations, but also with the application process and the authorisation process and the review process that was required to ensure that they remained justified, proportionate and necessary.
Did you have specific training on RIPA when that came into force?
I did, yes.
At paragraph 14 of your witness statement, you say that in November 2003 you were promoted to the post of DCI in SO13, the anti-terrorist branch at New Scotland Yard. Prior to this, you say you had no dealings with Special Branch, SO12, or the anti-terrorist branch, SO13, and no experience of the SDS. Is that right then? By November 2003, you'd had no previous dealings with SO12, SO13, or the SDS?
To my recollection, no.
Did you have an understanding that SO12 were responsible for intelligence gathering on national security and a terrorist threat, along with MI5, and SO13 was responsible for investigating terrorist offences with the aim of prosecution, so a more evidential approach?
Yeah, that's the way I would categorise it. So, intelligence gathering, the responsibility for that for national security matters sat with Special Branch and MI5. If there was a terrorist attack, the post-event investigation would be led by SO13, the anti-terrorist branch.
You describe relations between the two units as poor. Can you expand on that a little bit? And in particular, we're interested in the cell that was the conduit between SO12 and SO13. I think that sat on the same floor as SO13 in New Scotland Yard. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I arrived, having come from a crime background, which I've sort of described how I would have responsibility for managing the process that would gather intelligence against organised criminals. And when we're on the National Crime Squad, that would be criminals that were seen as the most dangerous criminals in the UK. I would also be responsible for ensuring the investigation of those criminals occurred through detective work by people who were not involved in the intelligence gathering against them. So it was a fused system, a fused model. And there would be safeguards in place to make sure that the intelligence gathering, the authorisations that were in place, were often not known to the elements of the investigation that were dealing with the investigation into those organised crime groups, but would be fed by that intelligence. So it was all under a single, if you like, command that would deal with that. That was the Special Crime Director at the time. I then went into the anti-terrorist branch and I found a siloed system where the anti-terrorist branch might ask, for instance, for surveillance or intelligence on a particular subject, and they would rely on SO12 telling them any information that they had about that subject, but SO12 would decide whether they were going to do any additional intelligence gathering against them. So for me, as a very experienced senior investigating officer at the time, I felt that this model that we were applying in policing for protecting Londoners and the UK from national security threats was clunky, and it was likely not to lead to the exploitation of opportunities to keep people as safe as we should have been doing. And the relationship between SO12 and SO13, and I think they're equally culpable to this, was incredibly poor. There was very little trust between them. There was at the time I arrived, I think poor relationships at the operating level. And the cell that you asked me about was an office on the 15th floor of Scotland Yard, where SO13 were based, where if the anti-terrorist branch investigators wanted any information, they would go into the cell, deposit a request, and then have to wait for a response with regards to any information that was known. But there was no discussion about opportunities to exploit any intelligence that might exist with regards to what SO12 were doing. There was no sharing of minds and thinking about what can we do to make sure that we get to understand as much as we possibly can about this particular organisation or this particular threat. It was very siloed, and in my view, it didn't help our ultimate outcome, which was to keep people safe.
At paragraph 174 of your witness statement on page 36, you talk about attempts that you made with others to bring about change prior to the amalgamation of the two operations, SO12 and SO13. So whilst you were a DCI and then subsequently a DSU in SO13, you talk about your and others lobbying to bring about change, and that's paragraph 174 to 175. What kind of lobbying took place? Who were you talking to, and what conversations were had?
So during that period, I'd reviewed some previous operations and used those reviews, terrorist attacks against the UK, where I felt that opportunities had been missed. And I used those almost as case studies to go to senior managers to say more could have been done if we'd have been more joined up. That fused model under a single command. And I remember having conversations, positive conversations, with Tim White, who was then the Detective Chief Superintendent, Peter Clark, who was then the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Janet Williams, who was the Commander in SO12, Tony Fuller, who was the Detective Superintendent in SO12, about trying to shift the SO12, SO13 model to something which I was more accustomed to with regards to the crime world. And people did seem to be listening. There was enthusiasm to try to progress a closer working relationship.
And those conversations were taking place 2003, 2004?
Yeah, and of course, during that period, we'd seen a significant shift with regards to the threat from terrorism against the UK. Obviously, we'd had the awful attacks at 9/11. There are many attacks internationally now occurring from the threats of Al-Qaeda. So we were doing a number of proactive operations, many of which resulted in successful arrests and prosecutions against people who are now representing that Al-Qaeda threat, seeking to bomb and do multi-casualty attacks against places in the UK. So we were, I think, starting to see a better relationship between SO12 and SO13.
In 2005, you were promoted to Detective Superintendent in SO13. You were in charge of covert ops, coordinating responses ultimately in response to the 7/7 bombings of London. And the 21st of July 2005 failed attacks, is that right?
Yeah, so I was given the role by then Deputy Assistant Commissioner Peter Clark to lead on all the proactive work and investigations into those responsible for both the attacks on the 7th of July and then subsequently, if you like, the manhunt because of the failed attacks, those who were responsible and had fled from the attempted bombings on the 21st of July. So I was then working very closely with SO12, and I ran the proactive operations room for most of the period where we identified, located, and arrested those responsible for the 21/7 failed bombings.
Is it right that you were Silver Command for the operation that led to the shooting and death of Jean-Charles de Menezes?
So I was a Silver Commander in the operations room and I was there that morning, that's correct.
And in the aftermath of that, were you fed any information about the family campaign seeking justice for John?
No.
Were you ever given information about what the family's concerns were and their campaign itself?
No, I had no involvement in that. I do recall when a decision was taken to prosecute the Metropolitan Police under the Health and Safety Act of 1974, going to a meeting, and my view was that we should accept that charge, we should plead guilty, because there was going to be an inquest which would hear the full circumstances of what had happened. I thought that was the right thing to do for the family. Obviously, the Met decided to contest that charge and we were found guilty. I gave evidence at the Old Bailey in that case.
What discussions were taking place in SO13 and SO12 at the time around reputational damage and the threat to the Met subsequently from that incident?
Other than what I've just described, where I felt that we should have pleaded guilty to the health and safety matter, and by the way, my view was that it was an inappropriate charge in many ways because it was legislation from 1974, and I don't think the people who wrote that legislation had those circumstances in mind, but I just thought it was the gracious thing to do because of the family. Other than that, I was an investigator. I wasn't involved in any discussions or, if you like, reputational management or receipt of any information or intelligence from any of the supporters of the family.
Was there any concern amongst senior officers at the time that there was going to be public disorder on the streets of London?
I don't recall that.
Were you made aware at that time of the SDS unit and that they may be able to provide any information?
No, but by that time, with obviously talking 2005, I was aware of the SDS. I'd actually had a conversation with a colleague who had been an operative on the SDS, who gave me, if you like, an orientation on the history of the SDS. And I was very concerned that they weren't able to provide the contemporary intelligence that we required around national security, and that they were deployed without me knowing the detail, but against groups that didn't represent a threat to national security. So there was a gap, and I was frustrated about that gap. And I remember in one of the meetings I had around trying to bring or introduce a new working relationship, which ultimately led to a project that looked at both commands and resulted in the amalgamation in, I think it was late 2006. I remember having meetings around, because I was the senior investigating officer for many of these threats, terrorist threats against London and the UK, that we needed to have a meaningful capability with regards to undercover to infiltrate some of those groups and gather evidence against them. And we had very little to offer with regards to suitable operatives with the right profile.
So as best you can now, in terms of the timing of those conversations with the former operative, can you pinpoint to the best of your ability when that was? Was it 2005?
I think it would have, well, certainly around the era, because I was the senior investigating officer for various operations, and colleagues of mine were equally as senior investigating officers investigating cases where they also shared the desire to get this sort of capability and coverage. I think it's 2004 probably through to 2006 when the amalgamation occurred. And the project team that was appointed, and there'll be, I think, a significant amount of material, looked at every part of the SO12 command and the SO13 command. They did an analysis of the capability, the raison d'etre for those elements of the command, and they were looking to design, if you like, the best possible amalgamated unit, making sure that they brought the commands together in a way that allowed us to hit the ground running, so there'd be no interruption with regards to our ability to gather intelligence and investigate national security threats.
So just to clarify, in terms of your first knowledge of the SDS from that first operative, that's from 2004?
I think he arrived at the SO13 command after I did. And I'm conscious of the need to be responsible around identities. If I could establish when he arrived in the command, and it was after me, he was aware of my frustrations, and he gave me a very rich understanding about the beginnings of the SDS and his time there, but also accepted the fact that the SDS now had, these are my words, not his, I can't recall them, effectively lost its way, and it needed to modernise. I would say that's probably 2004. I would guess it's 2004.
You should have pen and paper in front of you on the desk if you'd like to write down his name.
Yes, of
please.
course.
And in terms of what he said about the SDS having lost its way, can you remember any detail about that?
No, not. I mean, he would be able to assist, not specifically, I'm afraid, after all this time, no. But just that what I was looking for, the SDS wasn't able to offer with regards to the threats that we were facing in that period.
We know from the time just after John Charles de Menezes' death that there was some reporting from the SDS UCOs, and for instance we know that HN18 Robert Hastings was reporting on the peripheries of the campaign. He reported a number of on a number of individuals and their details, one of which is in your bundle, B39 MPS 00655522. There are about 3 intelligence reports very similar to this.
Right.
So we can see this is a report from the 19th of April 2006, so almost a year after the shooting. An activist working within the Justice campaign and his email address. I'm not going to go to each of the intelligence reports, but we can see from the RIPA authorisation documents in relation to HN18, one of which is at MPS 0066000 at page 6. We can see reference to his ability to gauge and assess any attempts to subvert or hijack the nascent campaign for justice for John Charles de Menezes.
Yes.
At paragraph 3. You were familiar at the time with these sorts of RIPA authorisation documents, were you? These authorisations and renewals and updates?
No, well, the date I think you said was April of 2006.
That was the date of the intelligence report, but in terms of his authorisation documents, it ranges from when he was in the field from about 2003. I think his date's 2003 to 2007. I'll check that.
Okay. I mean, what I would say is I've not seen this. When I became the Detective Chief Superintendent in probably the autumn of 2007, I wasn't aware of this. I mean, I have read, and forgive me, sir, I get to try and compartmentalise when you know things is quite difficult. I think either in this inquiry or subsequently I read that an operative from the SDS went to put flowers at the scene of John Charles's at the Stockwell Tube Station, the scene where there was a vigil for John Charles after the shooting. When I'd finished the activity of the 21st of July manhunt, I went and laid flowers at that vigil, but not as I did it because an innocent man had lost his life, nothing to do with any theatre or intelligence gathering, and I'd not known of any coverage of any campaign on behalf of John Charles.
Sorry, just to make my question clearer, I wasn't asking whether you were familiar with this document at the time, but rather the RIPA the style of the RIPA authorisation documents. You were aware of the types of documents that were being used.
Yeah. Forgive me. Yeah.
Sorry, I hadn't made that clear. Sorry, I must make clear that this document is actually 118, Simon Wellings's RIPA authorisation document, not 18's. So he was an operative from middle of 2001 to the end of 2007.
Okay.
Do you recall Simon Wellings at all?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
That's his cover name. You can have a look at the cipher list if you need to see his real name.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember that individual.
And another document in relation to him is MPS 0526807, page 9. And it's the last bullet point here. So we can see that he has reported since the last update in relation to the reaction of activists to the police shooting in Stockwell. And again, that appears in the RIPA documents. Another document in relation to HN18 is MPS 0526805. So MPS 0526805, page 16. And paragraph 4, please. And this is HN18, who I made reference to earlier, who was deployed between August 2004 and December 2007.
Yeah.
And again, it's this reference to being in a position within the organisation that will afford an opportunity to gauge and assess any attempt to subvert or hijack the nascent campaign for justice for John Charles de Menezes. He was infiltrating ISM, the International Solidarity Movement in London. Do you recall anything about that operation?
I don't, and I'll be very clear. I don't see any grounds for this sort of coverage using the intrusive tactic of undercover. So I didn't know anything about this, and this, in my view, should not have happened.
That was going to be my question to you.
Yeah.
Whilst you were looking for intelligence in relation to the terrorist plots and activities. You've made it quite clear what you think about this activity being undertaken in relation to some of the campaigns and political activities around what had happened.
So we were desperately trying to get information about people who sought to attack this country. And we seem to be doing undercover operations against people who are lobbying for justice, for accountability. The irony shouldn't be lost on anyone, and this should not have happened. I said in my opening remarks the SDS should have been closed down a long time before it actually was. This should not have occurred.
Can we move to page 23 of this document, please, at the top of the page? You can see in relation to the domestic assessment, this is a customer squad comment in relation to HN18's deployment, and it's signed off by TN24, who was a detective inspector in C Squad at the time, in September 2005, and I'll give you a moment just to read that paragraph.
Yes, I've read that.
Was ISM a group that was on your radar as posing any kind of threat to the UK?
No, so I'm obviously at this time trying to investigate people who did pose a threat, and I had no concerns. I had no knowledge about that group, and I do need to say this, having had the benefit of looking at some of the documentation that existed in advance of me joining or becoming, the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the covert functions for the Counter-Terrorism Command, which included the SDS. There is a pattern of sort of strategic direction from the Home Office around subversive groups. There's documents I've read through this inquiry dated 1994. I think there's a document that basically says that domestic terrorism is still a responsibility for Special Branch, but it should be commensurate with the very diminishing threat. And it talks about subversive activity, and I think there's a definition that it's those groups who seek to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy through political, industrial or violent means. But the shift is towards international terrorism. And in 2004, there's a document that sets out the guidelines from the Home Office for special branches that doesn't actually mention subversion. It mentions the priority of special branches is around countering the current terrorism threat. So none of this type of deployment, the deployments of the SDS, which caused me concerns when I properly got into the role, in my view, and I'm conscious that authorities were put in place, were justified.
And what about this threat of political groups making political capital out of the tragedy through attacking the police and government policy on Iraq? Was that something that you would have thought needed intrusive undercover surveillance?
Absolutely not. In my statement, I make clear I've got a very considerable history in covert policing and undercover policing, very considerable. It is an incredibly intrusive tactic. This is utterly disproportionate, and in no way are there grounds for this deployment to occur. No way.
In 2006, it was the 2nd of October 2006, SO12 Special Branch and SO13 Anti-Terrorist Branch merge and create SO15, Counter-Terrorism Command. And in 2007, you were promoted to the Detective Chief Superintendent in that command. You were allocated the operational support portfolio, by Commander John McDowell
Yes.
and DAC Peter Clark, who you've made reference to already.
Yes.
And that gave you line management supervision of the SDS, which
That's correct.
sat within S Squad at the time. In terms of the discussions that you had with McDowell and DAC Clark, you say that there were discussions about you looking at how the SDS was operating. What kind of concerns were they flagging to you at the time?
I think the general concern was about the long term, if I can describe it as intelligence deployments, the groups that they were deployed against. I think they were both reassured because of my experience and history in covert policing. And I will say, when I became the Detective Chief Superintendent, it's important I say this, a lot of work had been done, I think, by my predecessors, well, by Dave Zinzan. I mentioned Tony Fuller earlier in my testimony, who was in SO12. And of course by Superintendent Julia McKinney and Frankie Flood, the DCI. A huge amount of work had been done to try to modernise the SDS and move it forward. And I think my appointment as the DCS was probably quite a reassuring thing for both Commander McDowell and Peter Clark to finally sort things out as to whether we could get the unit to be deployed against proportionate and justified individuals and groups, and trained, and the management of operations properly undertaken, or not, basically.
We've heard that quite a bit of work was commissioned by Commander Williams as well.
Yes.
There was the Walton report of March 2004.
Yes.
And the Crane review, which was behind your tab B35. That's MPS 0749483 at page 2. Were you familiar with the Walton report and the Crane review?
So I wasn't familiar with the Walton report. I wasn't aware of that. I have no recollection of that I was aware of that. I do, I think, have a recollection of the Crane report. I think that was commissioned when it was under SO12, and I mentioned having a meeting with Janet Williams and others at some stage before the amalgamation, where there was, I think, an appetite to modernise both SO12 and SO13, and we had a specific conversation about the SDS.
Mr. Boutcher, you mentioned the Home Office guidelines on special branch work. If I can take you first to the 1994 Home Office guidelines behind tab B14, MPS 0727509, page 2. We can see down at paragraph 4. So if we just go to the end of the document, please, we should have the date. You can see these are the July 1994 guidelines. Back to page 2, paragraph 4, we can see that countering the threat of terrorism is the most important single function of special branch.
Yes, and this was 2004.
This is the 1994.
94.
The 94 guidelines.
Yes, thank you.
The 2004 guidelines, I'll come to it in a moment. Page 3, please, paragraph 12. We can see that the responsibility for gathering intelligence on animal rights extremist activity falls within special branch.
Yes.
And at paragraph 13 and 14, we can see that assessments of public order implications of events such as marches and demos are useful for police officers maintaining the Queen's peace, the Queen at the time.
Yes.
And intelligence about threats to public order remains a key special branch responsibility. That's the first sentence in paragraph 14.
Yes.
And if you can see within that paragraph, it doesn't mention special branch being able to disrupt or prevent public order. It's mainly about intelligence gathering in relation to potential public disorder.
Yes.
And did you appreciate that at the time when you took over responsibility for SO 15? Was there an element of public order that you felt you had responsibility for, or did your background in anti-terrorism completely blind you to the need to provide intelligence in relation to public order?
I don't think it blinded me to it. I think both the 94 and 2004 Home Office guidelines show a decreasing necessity or justification for focus on subversive groups, basically. There was still a responsibility for the Met to ensure that London was safe and tranquil and people could go about their business, which included, ensuring that where there was protest, it was lawful protest, and we enabled lawful protest. So I had an awareness around the need to get information around public order issues. I'd not been involved in doing that particularly, I have to say. My career's almost entirely been spent tackling organised crime or terrorism, but I wasn't oblivious to it.
So did you have an appreciation that Gold Command for big public order events in London would benefit from the intelligence provided by Special Branch, or what used to be Special Branch and the SDS unit? Yes,
I did. And I know in these proceedings there's a Gold Commander for an event that we may come on to. For the public order was a Commander Joe Kay, who was a colleague and a friend of mine, and Joe would do a lot of public order events, so we would be close colleagues, and I would understand the challenges of policing those large-scale public order events through his explanations to me about the difficulties often of trying to make sure that they passed off peacefully.
Did you see that there was a requirement for intelligence garnered from undercover operations for that purpose?
So again, I think I've said there has to be, it's about proportionality and justification of the use of what is a highly intrusive tactic. I'm sure it's been discussed in this inquiry. The beginnings of the SDS came about in 1968 because of the public disorder at Grosvenor Square. I think I've said in the documents both in 94 and 2004 there's a diminishing risk from people seeking to undermine parliamentary democracy. So if the root of your question is around the need for the SDS to infiltrate groups around public order, I'm afraid I would take a view that it wasn't proportionate to do so on the threat that existed from public order. There are other ways, and you should start with the least intrusive to obtain information to keep society safe.
And did you have conversations with C-Desk in relation to the customer needs for intelligence around public order?
I don't recall doing so, no.
Was there any attempt to understand the needs of the customers of the SDS for public order intelligence at the time when you took over?
Well, I don't recall specifics. It's quite a long time ago, but I think even within Special Branch, there was an acceptance of the need, which I hope I described earlier in my testimony, to refocus the capabilities that we had in SO13 and SO12 collectively on the threats, the most serious threats to London and the UK nationally. And the work I described actually around the project team looking at the priorities of all the different units was to make sure that what those units were doing was in line with the contemporary threats. Have we got an outdated capability looking at things that we shouldn't be looking at? And that work, I'm sure, well, quite likely, the Met often doesn't get rid of documentation, will exist, that would give an analysis around what was done in circa 2006 to look at, if you like, the ongoing necessity of units in SO13 and in SO12. So that work would have been done.
You mentioned the 2004 guidelines. This is at UCPI 2789, please. We can go to page 2. And it's the second paragraph, please.
Yes. Yes.
And so that was your understanding of special branch work generally in the main priorities?
Yeah, the guidelines from the Home Office in 2004, yeah.
When DCI Dell gave his evidence to this inquiry on the 30th of June 2026, he said that the SDS UCOs did preliminary work before SO10 UCOs could take over. What's your view of the value of the UCO work that was being done in a preliminary intelligence gathering capacity for then another unit to take over and use that in an evidential way?
So I'd not heard of that. I didn't follow Mr. Dell's testimony. I think my position, and I hope I'm making it clear, is the concerns about that deployment with regards to the risks that it presents for an intelligence-only operation and the lack of management and control and oversight. So I don't know of any examples where that's happened actually, but I would not be in favour of doing anything where there wasn't proper control of UCOs and a justification for their deployment. So I'd probably be concerned about that. Can
we have up, please, behind tab B26, MPS 26923, page 3. This is the Code of Practice for SDS officers from the 7th of January 2000.
Okay, thank you.
And we can see at 1.5, within the framework of the new code, the Home Office guidelines on the work of Special Branch in Great Britain, and obviously this is before the 2004 guidelines came in.
Yeah.
Its primary purpose is to assist the Commissioner of Police by obtaining high-grade intelligence about public order events, the activities of groups or individuals involved in politically motivated crime, including crime related to animal rights and environmental activity and terrorism, as well as assisting the security service in discharging its duties. Not necessarily subversive activities, though,
Yeah.
but political demonstrations, animal rights and environmental activity falls in a different category to subversion, as was traditionally understood. Was there a role for undercover officers in those groups?
In my opinion, no. There's other ways, less intrusive ways to get the information that we needed to achieve those aims.
If we move on to page 4, 1.7, paragraph 1.7, we can see here that there may be occasions where the officer might be arrested, and that all arrests will be reported to the officer at the OCU commander as soon as practicable.
Yeah.
Did you appreciate when you took over that arrests in a public order context could be part and parcel of the job?
Well, I can well understand how that would obviously happen if you've got SDS officers at protest. That could well happen. I defer to my point that SDS officers shouldn't be deployed in those groups. And if I may read, this can best be described as behaviour in role and may be essential to preserve his/her cover and safety and to further the objectives set out in paragraph 1. All arrests will be reported to the OCU commander as soon as practicable. What's missing there, and it may be in the document, is that, and I know it's been, I'm sure, well said at this inquiry, any prosecution, any arrest that leads to a prosecution, a court must never be misled. And there should be measures in place to make sure that, and I'm very certain that this has not happened in the past with the SDS, that the court are informed with regards to any UCO being prosecuted under a false name for an offence, such as being in a public order situation where they're arrested and prosecuted.
So I note the time. I've got a couple of more questions on this document. If I may finish on this document before we
Finish that,
go
and then
to a
we'll have
break.
a short break.
Thank you. Page 5 then of this document, paragraph 2.61, links into the point that I think you're making about a court being misled, but also that the legal privilege that attaches to court proceedings. Does this chime with your understanding of what legal privilege was and what should be done about that if an officer was to be come into contact with that?
So I'd have huge concerns around the knowledge, the access to information of operatives during this period to legally privileged information that wasn't properly handled and dealt with. And that again is another consequence of this style of deployment. And I am not convinced that the handling of legally privileged material occurred properly with the deployments of the SDS. In fact, I'm almost certain it was not properly handled.
we heard some evidence from DCI Dell about this last sentence: communications and items held with the intention of furthering a criminal purpose and not matters subject to legal privilege. And in relation to a prosecution that involved HN3 being asked to be a defence witness for core participants to this inquiry, when they were arrested outside Grosvenor House on an occasion where they were demonstrating against the Farnborough Air Show. And the suggestion that their defence, if it was fabricated, leading to an offence of perjury, then put any otherwise LPP material outside of the LPP protection. Have you ever heard of a practice like that?
I haven't. And what I would say, and obviously I'm now in contemporary terms involved in lots of management of covert authorities, legal advice should be sought immediately, and the proper handling of anything that could attract LPP should occur. And there's no reference to that in what I'm reading. And again, I think this probably represents another concern with regards to the nature of these intelligence-only deployments.
Paragraph 3.1, please, on page 7. It says halfway through the paragraph, where deployment may result in the acquisition of confidential material, the authorising officer will be an assistant commissioner. How important was it that operations that could touch upon confidential material, including LPP, should be authorised at a very high level?
Vitally important. And of course, which is the case now and wasn't the case then, I will say, is that those senior officers need training in that function around authorising such a covert intrusive tactic, and some guidance with regards to what they need to consider with regards to that authority and the continuance of it and the management of it.
Reference is made in this paragraph to paragraph 3.3, and if we can go to that, please, further down page 7. Sorry, at the top of page. Yeah, page 8. So confidential material acquisition would be authorised where it touches on serious crime or in the interests of national security.
Yes.
As far as your understanding goes, did that fit with the undercover deployments that were being authorised in the SDS?
No. And the confidential material, the special category status, whether it be lawyers, journalists, all of those additional rightful protections that exist, I'm very certain would not have been in place with regards to these deployments.
Did you take steps when you came into position to ensure that LPP was protected and to prevent the further dissemination of LPP material?
If I'm frank, when I got into position, I started a series of events to make sure that we talked about the NUTAC course, that we introduced mechanisms to alert the operatives to their legal responsibilities. I can't say the date that I began as the Detective Chief Superintendent. It was possibly August. I took the decision to close that unit down pretty quickly. So some of the things that I would have sought to do to professionalise the unit, to provide the right justification and necessity for the deployments, to reassure the organisation, the Met Police, that we were doing this properly. And this was all, by the way, I think in line with the progress of bringing the two commands together, modernising our capability to deal with national security threats at the time, because of matters that we I'm sure we'll come on to around the resistance to what needed to be done. I made representations to temporary Assistant Commissioner Clark, strong representations that the only way to deal with this was to close it down.
Just to finish on this document, at page 4, paragraph 1.10. Sorry, page 4, 1.10. Collateral intrusion
Yes.
is mentioned there. Give you a moment to read that. What practicable steps could be taken to avoid collateral intrusion in such operations?
So again, this is about the authorisation process, the directing to the undercover officer, the training of the undercover officer, the management of the information that the undercover officer passes back to the investigative or intelligence body. There are a number of mechanisms and safeguards that need to be put in place. And by the way, in this sentence, before authorising any undercover operations, authorised officers will take into account the risk of intrusion into privacy of persons other than the specific target of the undercover operation. The collateral intrusion also applies to the target of the undercover operation. They're not exempt from being protected from things that aren't relevant to the tasking. So I would disagree with that statement. And then it says measures will be taken wherever practical to avoid collateral intrusion.
So where we've heard evidence from some of the UCOs that said, well, I was just reporting everything to do with my target, everything about their lives, what they did, and their associates, their families, friends, that would fall within collateral intrusion, and that would be something that you would say needed to be stopped. You don't report on that.
Properly managed, stopped, and dealt with regards to what the officers were reporting on and what then happened to any of that information that came into the organisation.
And whose responsibility was it to do that?
I think it sits through the whole, if you like, through the whole structure of the deployment, from the undercover officer, the cover officer, the detective inspector in this case in charge of the SDS, the DCI. The authorised officer should be made aware immediately of any such issues, and certainly upon the next review should not pass without any collateral intrusions being raised, and what's been done to deal with that, and direction to the UCO to make sure that doesn't happen and that reporting isn't done in that fashion.
Thank you.
We'll now have the usual morning break because we had an earlier one. 10 minutes to 10 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Boutcher, to continue just on the issue of collateral intrusion that we looked at before the break, can I have up, please, MPS 0073693 behind tab B49 of the bundle, sir? It's an intelligence report of the 15th of May 2007 by HN18. And I'll give you a moment just to read that, but you will see that it's about highly personal information.
Yes.
Relating to the subject of that report. And behind tab B50 we have MPS 0075095, an intelligence report from the 18th of July 2007, again by HN18, in relation to one of the CPs to this inquiry, Mr. Chowdhury, and his girlfriend's birthday party and their relationship.
Yes, sorry.
The evidence that you were giving just before the break, that can be taken down now, please, was in terms of the responsibility of excluding material like that finding its way into a sanitised official report and being disseminated to intelligence desks. You would say that could be prevented, and training would be a major part of that.
Yeah, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't be on a document like that.
Training on Article 8, private life.
Article 8, Article 10. Yeah.
Just the principles of privacy.
Yep.
Looking behind tab B51 then, MPS 0075571. This is the SDS section introductory guide. This is written before the amalgamation of SO 12 and 13 that we can see reference is made to that in paragraph 1. Had you read this document when you arrived in charge of the SDS?
I have absolutely no recollection, and I genuinely don't believe I did.
Page 26, please. We can see the effectively third paragraph down behind the second redaction box.
Yes.
Advises UCAs to be friendly and accept their invitations to a drink. This is referring to the target groups. A party or a barbecue. Eventually you will find yourself at weddings, funerals, and possibly the odd court case with your wearies. View every opportunity for contact as a way to increase your access, security, and credibility with them. So in terms of the level of intrusiveness that some of the UCOs engaged in, this appears to have been part of the guidance that was given to UCOs.
Yes.
What do you say about that?
Well, it's wrong, and even the language is offensive. Forgive me, with your wearies. The whole thing shouldn't exist. It shouldn't have been written. It's entirely the wrong approach, and I think I've made my position clear. This is the opposite of what they should be doing.
Behind tab B53, MPS 0527121, page 3, please. We can see that this is an SDS note from September 2007, so just when you arrive, detailing examples of the squad providing value for money. Is this a document that you had requested?
I believe I did. I requested this from either Detective Superintendent McKinney or DCI Flood, and I think I actually said I want the operatives to give you the examples of what they've done, so that we got it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, around anything, and we didn't miss anything. And this was, I think, I asked for five years of examples of good work.
So we understand from HN118 Simon Wellings's evidence that he played a role in preparing this document, the SDS value for money,
Right.
at the request of DI HN773. You might want to look at
Yes.
that cipher in your list.
Thank you.
And that was in relation to evidence that he gave on the 16th of March this year. But it also passed a note to
Yes.
CTI about a DCI who had then become a DSU who asked him to prepare something similar, and that name was Mr. McKinney.
Yes.
So would it be fair to say that you'd asked Mr. McKinney, that had been passed down the chain,
Very possible.
and ultimately HN18 Simon Wellings has prepared this document
Got
that
the
has
job to do it, yes.
passed its way back to you?
Yes.
And do you recall reading that?
I do recall the document, yeah.
Page, well, the first reference is to the Ariel Sharon visit
Yes.
in July 2003. Do you recall that event happening back in 2003?
I don't. Obviously, it predated me in this role, so I didn't recall the visit by the Prime Minister. But
Okay. You weren't involved in public order policing at all?
no,
Back
no.
in those days, right.
I was on the flying squad, I think, actually then. I arrived into the anti-terrorist branch in late 2003. So at this point, I was on the flying squad in the July.
There's reference here in the first paragraph to MT as a young Arab man with extreme left-wing political views, a prominent member of the anti-capitalist group Globalised Resistance, and his activism centred around the plight of the Palestinian people. We understand that the person that is being referred to here, MT, and this will be somebody that's on your civilian cipher list, but if the actual real identity of this person is not going to make any difference to you, it may not assist.
Okay, no, it doesn't assist.
But this person, we understand, it was not a young Arab man at all. In fact, he was of a Pakistani background.
Right.
But here, does the reference to him being Arab make this more salacious, more a concern when we're talking about Ariel Sharon's visit?
Potentially, it does. I mean, I'm sure you'll take me to this. I'm very clearly of the view that many of the things that the SDS said they did well, they did not do well, and they embellished and exaggerated things that they thought were examples of good work. And I think this inquiry has established that.
Well, the next two paragraphs, and you can take time to read it if you need to refresh your memory, but it talks about a bomb vest, a dummy bomb vest, having been constructed, which we understand there was no intelligence report to support that assertion, and further that the vest was retrieved and destroyed by HN118 on the eve of the supposed stunt. Again, no intelligence report from him to support that. And in fact, HN18 suggests that this report, although he did the first draft, somebody appears to have gilded the lily.
HN118 is, I think it is, not 18.
Sorry, did I say 18?
Yes,
I meant
you did.
118. Simon Wellings.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, sir. So I think from the assistance of the documents provided through the inquiry and my memory, this was considerably exaggerated, and the document was being added to by unknown parties with information that wasn't accurate.
Can you assist with who might have helped to draft this document?
Well, I think I asked for the operatives to provide the information. I didn't know specifically, or don't recall, it might be that I didn't know at the time, forgive me, who had done it. And it's hard to compartmentalise in time when you realise things. But obviously I'm aware that I don't think the vest was destroyed. I think the description was wrong, exaggerated. Just an example again of overclaiming something which should never happen. And this was an opportunity for them to show what they were actually doing with regards to justifying the deployments. And in a 5-year window that I asked for, I think they gave me 4 or 5 examples, and I was very questioning of a couple of them as to their actual role in making any difference whatsoever.
We've received evidence from the person known as MT that he was not the person that suggested this stunt. In fact, it was a white British activist who jokingly referred to this, and the idea was fairly quickly dismissed. Did you have any further knowledge of what had actually happened around that? Did you investigate this situation with 118 himself?
No, I didn't, but none of what you tell me now, which I wasn't aware of, surprises me.
Page 3, paragraph 7, looks at the cost benefit.
Yes, thank you.
And what is suggested to be the cost benefit of this intelligence. And we can see that some parallels are drawn with the Jean-Charles de Menezes incident.
Yes.
And the,
Sorry, yes, I see that, sorry.
And the costs of an inquiry. Do you agree that the perception of that as a positive effect for the of SDS intelligence is properly exhibited here, given that these were entirely different scenarios?
So this, again, is an example, a distasteful, inappropriate example of the SDS justifying things which they falsified, and the association in the bottom line with regards to the tragic death of John Charles de Menezes is entirely inappropriate. And
would you say that that's a misuse of the death of an entirely innocent man to promote the SDS?
It's obscene to read this, and it's wrong, and it should never have been done. And it's indicative of the culture that I found when I actually became the Detective Chief Superintendent, and of the briefings that I got from, the exemplary DCI Frankie Flood and incredibly hardworking Julia McKinney in trying to change things.
The penultimate paragraph on this page relates to the state visit of George Bush from the US in November 2003. I think that was the month that you were promoted to DCI in SO13. Do you recall this visit?
I do, because the senior firearms commander for the visit was a friend of mine and had no sleep worrying about the entire visit in planning the firearms response with his American colleagues. So I do recall the visit, yeah.
We can see that last paragraph on page 3, the SDS reporting was able to inform a wide swathe of the policing plan for this visit, including an early recommendation that anticipated demonstrator numbers be revised upwards by a factor of 10. And this was later revised to an even higher number and proved highly accurate. Was SO12 or SO13 estimates so woefully inaccurate without the SDS reporting?
I'm not sure I can make comment on that. What I would say, and it's disappointing to say this, I think this inquiry needs to look at all of the documents provided by SDS operatives and sergeants and the management with great scepticism with regards to their accuracy.
We can see the first paragraph on the next page, intelligence provided by SDS. It goes on to talk about the poll tax riot. A demonstration was expected on the scale of the poll tax disorder. In fact, no serious disorder took place. Again, is that illustrative of the type of sceptical reporting that you're referring to?
Overclaiming and trying to justify an existence where I'm afraid from the moment I arrived and looked at the groups that they were deployed against, I could find, and I didn't look at the authorities when I arrived, I looked at the groups, I could find no justification for this intrusive tactic to be deployed against those groups whatsoever.
Did you believe this document at the time, or did this suddenly start bells ringing when you were reading it?
So it's difficult to recall. What I think it would be fair for me to say that I was incredibly sceptical about anything that the SDS informed me about. And this smacked to me of an exaggeration, an overclaiming of the productivity, the outputs of the unit. And for asking for, I think, a very reasonable window of time of 5 years from the operatives themselves to tell me what they've done, to keep London safe, to keep society safe. And this was the document they produced, which I now know was embellished and falsified by people who I don't know who they are, to add claims that were completely false. Sums up the situation.
We can see in terms of the cost-benefit analysis here at paragraph 5 on page 4. You can highlight that, please. That reference is made in the second paragraph to the embarrassment that would have presumably have been caused to UK PLC and financial saving in not tying up officers in defending the service against negative publicity. Again, would that have been a justification for undercover officers being deployed?
There isn't any justification for undercover officers providing this sort of information. You get it through much less intrusive means. And I have to say, it almost looks akin to fairy tales, to be quite frank. And all of this, accumulatively at the time, because it was a very short period of time that I was there before I took the decision I did to close the unit down, contributed to that.
Following on from this, this document goes on and looks at the June 2005 G8 Glen Eagles summit and the G8 summit in Germany in 2007, the EU summit in 2007, and the NATO summits in 2007. Did you have similar concerns in relation to those as well?
I think generally across the document, I had concerns about the accuracy of what I was being presented with,
And so what integrity investigations followed? Were there any people interviewed? Were senior officers kind of made aware of these sort of concerns that you had?
So I would have been speaking to, and I talked about the progression with regards to the amalgamation of the two commands and if you like, the effort to modernise the policing response at Scotland Yard around national security, I would have been raising these issues, my concerns, with John McDowell, extremely experienced and very impressive commander who had concerns about undercover policing that he expressed to me of the SDS, and most certainly with Peter Clark. And Peter Clark, I don't know the timings, but at a point in time, he became the ACSO, Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, so the highest police officer in the UK overseeing national security and terrorism. He, I know, had visited the off-site unit of the SDS at some point around this era. And we had a number of discussions around my concerns and his anxiousness, I think, about the SDS, which resulted in me ultimately going to him after a series of events and efforts to change things where I reached a tipping point where I knew that this couldn't continue and we couldn't change things because of the resistance. So it sounds quite, brutal, but it needed to close down.
In terms of understanding the exaggeration around some of the reports, was there any discussion around accountability and whether people ought to be disciplined for what appears to have been misconduct?
I think the focus, I can understand the reason for the question. I think the focus was simply on moving forward, creating a capability that could deal with the threats that we were facing, which became something of the Special Projects team, which is what I, if you like, had a vision to create as a network capability across the UK of undercover capability in this sort of national security arena. I will say I didn't consider, I didn't think it was probably proportionate at the time with regards to what we were doing, any disciplinary action for this. I do have to say, having heard some of the inquiry information that I knew nothing about, there should have been disciplinary action for a number of issues that I'm now aware of that you may draw my attention to, and I have no idea why that failed to happen.
Had there been any discussion at all about that with McDowell or DAC Clark?
Around disciplinary issues? Yeah. No, not for this. This was, embellishing, exaggerating. It was almost like a rearguard action to justify the existence, I think, of the SDS. But I do need to be clear, having read the information that's been put before me by this inquiry, around coercive controlling behaviour, sexual relationships, drug taking, violence, drink driving. I am aghast at why disciplinary investigations did not take place for those issues. And if I'd been made aware of them, I can absolutely assure you that that would have happened.
Was there a culture in what became SO15 of a need-to-know basis, people not being told about events, that, matters that have been investigated previously?
I think some of this stems, if I may, from, it wasn't really SO15. I think we were trying to create a new culture across both commands, which was a challenge because you were bringing people together who effectively didn't like each other very much, didn't respect each other very much, didn't appreciate each other's roles very much. And by the way, SO15 now, I think, is an example, probably the finest example of counter-terrorism policing. It's the decision to take that, which was a very brave one, all the people involved who made it happen, should be congratulated for that. The SDS within SO12, many people in SO12 quite likely didn't know of the existence of the SDS. It didn't figure, I think you're probably aware from the inquiry testimony already, on any organogram. It was very much a secret within Special Branch, which itself was a very secret department. And I think any wrongdoing and all I can offer is any wrongdoing was seen as being unable to be addressed because it would reveal the existence of this secret department. Well, the public interest. We failed the public interest by not dealing with those acts of wrongdoing, and they completely trump the need to keep the existence of the SDS secret completely. The public interest then was about the trust and confidence of policing, and we failed to make the right decisions.
And to what extent was that contributed to by a lack of professional curiosity and the failure to ask questions by more senior managers?
So this was the tail wagging the dog. People who presented themselves as subject matter experts in undercover policing, and they were not. Telling senior officers repeatedly that they knew what they were doing and the senior officers just had to sign off things. That's my interpretation of this. Well, that stopped. And I think then people began to realise, and subsequently through Operation Hearn and the sort of speaking to people, understanding what had been presented through various unacceptable behaviours over the years, has, I think, ultimately led to this important inquiry happening. And all of that should have been identified and dealt with much earlier. And it should have been dealt with by us, the police. It should have been dealt with by us.
And we've seen evidence about some of the misconduct being written about. It's been documented,
Yes.
yet not read by people further up the chain. And we'll come to the A and B litigation in due course. But can you help us understand why it was that senior officers were not paying attention to things that were documented and referenced?
So I can't speak for them. I can only surmise, and it's the only thing I can think that they must have been thinking about, is that the value of the SDS was so important to Special Branch, the Metropolitan Police, the safety in London and elsewhere, that overrode any misconduct or inappropriate behaviour. And if that was their view, then that view was entirely misplaced and wrong. The things that I'm now aware of that did become known to very senior police officers who I've huge respect for, I'm at an absolute loss as to why Department of Professional Standards within the Metropolitan Police weren't appointed to investigate individuals, indeed the SDS, or why an independent police body or force was not commissioned to come in and do an investigation into the conduct of the unit. That's what should have happened.
And at what stage should that have happened, in your view?
As soon as behaviours that became known to senior officers were known. And I go back to, I mentioned in my opening remarks about the fathering of a child and abandoning of that child. I think that particular officer had 4 intimate relationships, became the DI of the unit. That behaviour became known. You just mentioned the litigation of officers A and B. I've looked at those documents which talk about drug taking, violence, drink driving. I am at a loss. I have no answer for you as to why that wasn't dealt with and investigated thoroughly and properly and independently, because it should have been.
Those statements were written in 2003, so you're saying there should have been an investigation in relation to that as early as 2003?
Now I've heard, through this inquiry, what I've heard, this unit should have been closed down years before it was. It was causing damage to members of the public. It was causing damage to the operatives who were deployed. It was a disaster in the latter years of its existence. I can't speak for earlier years, and there may be testimony that this inquiry is heard from earlier tranches, but to my knowledge of this unit, it should have been closed down many years ago. before it was closed down in 2007.
I'd like to move on, please, to the arrest of Robert Hastings, known
Before
as...
we do, can we
sorry.
just look at the heading of this document? Examples of the squad providing, quote, value for money, close quote. Was that what you were asking?
I was asking for really their performance, what they'd done to justify their existence. I think I don't recall value for money. That may have been an interpretation by either Superintendent McKinney or DCI Flood. I wanted them to show me why they needed to exist. What did they do for policing? What did they do to keep the public safe?
Thank you. Forgive me for interrupting.
Thank you. Robert Hastings was known as Robert Harrison in the field, and we know him as HN18, or his Hearn nominal is HN18 as well. He was arrested in September 2007, just as you came onto the scene in your role as Detective Chief Superintendent, and that was in relation to a state of emergency protest against the Defence Systems and Equipment International exhibition, the DICE exhibition, a biannual event.
Yes.
Can you recall details about that?
I can't about the exhibition. I knew it was some sort of arms fair, I think, from recollection. I just do need to say, forgive me to branch off very briefly, on the website, I've seen the testimony of Maya, and I just want to say with regards to Hastings and his behaviour, coercive, controlling, abusive behaviour of that young lady, an apology. It should never have happened. It's hard to read her statement through what he did to that young girl, and it's important that I say that.
And would that sentiment extend to other deceived women as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I mention Maya is in my Rule 9 submission, I was asked if I knew about that relationship, which I did not. And so I am now aware of the details of that relationship specifically. But for anybody, and again I reference my opening remarks, that have been affected by this unit and the activities of these officers, I can't apologise enough.
HN18 at the time, 2007, understood his role was to gather intelligence relating to the international solidarity movement in London, no borders and the state of emergency. And that's in his witness statement. Can we bring up, please, behind tab B54, MPS 0526779, page 2. This is the Operation Alloy running log regarding a meeting held by the Disarm DICE activists, which was the direct action activity being planned at the time, and the decision on an action to attempt entry to the Excel Centre.
Yes.
We can see that the date that this intelligence is received is the 9th of September, and the action was being planned for Tuesday the 11th. So it's the Sunday, the 9th of September.
Okay, yeah.
That intelligence, we can see from the final column on the right, was to be provided to the Gold briefing.
The Gold public order briefing.
That's what we understand,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a document, which I'll come to in a moment, that suggests you were at least informed of this activity by Wednesday evening to the 12th. Can you recall when you were first told about this plan?
So the first I knew of this was when I got a phone call. From my recollection, the phone call was from DCI Flood. And it was an evening. I remember that because I'd left Scotland Yard and was walking towards the train station at Victoria. And he somewhat stopped me in my tracks to say there'd been this arrest. What I didn't know, and I wouldn't be expected to know it, I need to be clear, about what had happened with this intelligence on the 9th. The first I knew about this particular issue was when, after the arrest had taken place, and after the release of the UCO. I didn't know anything about this particular operation or the deployment going through this activity.
The document, you may not have seen it, I don't think it was in your bundle, but it's MPS 0526774. We can see there the directions at the bottom, that last entry at item 5, if that can be enlarged. Can you read that? JB
Just about.
informed tonight.
Yes.
And that was at 5 p.m. and you can see the date at the top of that note.
Yes.
And we understand this to be a note of DSU McKinney.
Okay.
It was the 12th of September 2007.
So the day
So
after.
that's Wednesday.
Yeah.
So the day after he'd been arrested. Does that?
That would chime with, and certainly in the evening I got the call, but I'm as certain as I can be the call was from DCI Flood.
What would you have expected managers to do once they received that information on the Sunday, the 9th? What would the immediate steps be that they should have taken?
So to get the chronology right, as I understood it, that the UCA was in custody for a period of time, and that the detective inspector for the unit knew of that and didn't inform either DCI Flood or Detective Superintendent McKinney, and waited for events to take their course, I suppose. Now, if we go backwards, the whole management of these operations should be so carefully undertaken that the risk of arrest, and there are times when operatives will be arrested through a plan that there will be in an undercover deployment, but the risk of arrest needs to be managed throughout because of the exposure. It struck me, and it is a long time ago, that the SDS, having had inputs into change, you mentioned the Crane review, the Walton review, Fuller had done work with them, Zinzan had done work with them, they'd had Julian and Frankie working with them for a while. The efforts to make sure that the oversight and the governance and the scrutiny of the deployments were much more tightly controlled, again, seem to be being ignored. And you would have expected, through the authorisation process, right from that sort of commander level down, there to have been a grip on the deployments and what might happen, the collateral of arrests, what you might do to avoid arrests, the risk that there might be some action on that particular day, the briefing to them about that risk. And again, I think there was just, in all of the above that I've just mentioned, an absence of that. And I recall both Detective Superintendent McKinney and DCI Flood being incredibly frustrated about, feeling that again, and I don't have any doubt these issues had happened before, that level of grip and management wasn't happening.
We heard evidence from Emily Apple, who was one of the activists involved in the action, that nobody was forced to engage in this direct action. So when the activists gathered at the squat the night before, anybody could pull out at any time, given the nature of the activity. Could the issue of arrest and attendance at court have been averted, and should it have been?
So, without knowing that, I would have said that a good cover officer would be speaking to a UCA all the time about off-ramps with regards to when you're deployed, about how you avoid getting involved in compromising or difficult positions, and one of those would be arrest. And I am as certain as I can be that that new approach, which would have been something that I would have been accustomed to with a more tightly controlled operational activity, was explained to, that direction was given to the operatives, but they chose to continue as they had always operated. And I think this particular arrest is an example of that, if you like, refusal to comply with what we were trying to do with the unit in modernising it and changing it what I would have said was for the better.
Were you aware at the time that there had been numerous arrests of SDS UCOs in the past?
I had no doubt, and I don't know how well the inquiries established this, that many arrests will have taken place, that the people who should have been informed were not informed. People would have been, through minor sanctions at court, in their covert identities, and nobody would have been made the wiser because of the way this unit operated. I've got no doubt about that.
We've got the closing report behind B78, MPS 0722622. We'll come to this in a little bit more detail later on, but if I can just take you to page 49, and this is the closing report that was authored in 2009 after the SDS had closed.
Yeah, the June 2009, is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Okay, yeah.
We can see at paragraph 1 that the author of this report established that a total of 21 entries were found on an Excel spreadsheet relating to arrests of SDS field officers in role, but that was only up until 1992. You can see at the end of that paragraph.
Yes.
In paragraphs 4 to 5, second sentence in that paragraph 4 says, this runs counter to the golden rule of never misleading a court. We've heard reference to a golden rule in the evidence that we've received from other officers, and the golden rule under Bob Lambert's watch was never expose the SDS. There seems to be a conflict in terms of exposing the unit or the operations, as opposed to the golden rule that's set out here, which is never misleading a court. There's obviously a conflict between the two. Is that something you're aware of?
So I strongly suspect, very strongly suspect, that this is the thin end of the wedge with regards to those number of arrests. I am very certain that they'll be much higher.
We can see over the page, onto page, top of page 50.
Right.
The officer who was engaged in managing the arrest of HN18 had been arrested himself and shown out, disclosed that he was an officer.
The detective inspector. Okay. Yeah.
And this may also go some way to explain the relaxed attitude demonstrated when one of his field officers was arrested and charged in his pseudonym whilst deployed in role and was due to appear in court in the last year of SDS operations. Was that your sense of what was happening? It was a really relaxed approach to arrest and charge and potential appearance in court.
So this, it had been made very clear, I'm very confident, through my predecessors and the work that I think Commander Williams was trying to do to change all of this. But changing a culture that's so embedded, there was a point in time where, and it was very quickly reached by me, that I realised we weren't going to be able to achieve that. The comments, I think you mentioned, from Bob Lambert around the maintaining of the secrecy of the SDS. We joined policing all at the same rank, with aspirations to keep London safe in the case of joining the Metropolitan Police. How officers then joined Special Branch and lost perspective with regards to their roles as police officers, acting without any regard to well-founded principles about never misleading a court, the legislation around the deployment for this incredibly intrusive tactic. How we got to this position, I really can't understand, other than the leadership of this unit over a number of years and the lack of intrusive scrutiny as to what these people were doing is as serious as the misconduct that we have referenced in my testimony this morning. Lambert should never have given those directions. He should never have behaved like that. He should never have been the DI on this unit. The insular way that they approach their recruitment, and again, I reference this we know best attitude, the lack of exposure outside of Special Branch, almost believing there was some sort of extension of MI5 or MI6, an intelligence agency. They were part of the Metropolitan Police Service, is, I think, tantamount to the reasons as to why this unit got into this mess. And it should have been stopped years ago.
The Excel spreadsheet that's referenced in the closing report, did you become aware of this Excel spreadsheet? Did you make any investigation as to how many arrests had been, the SDS had been involved in?
I did not. I think by this stage I've actually undertaken another role for something else, so I did not know.
Could you have made those inquiries at the time when Rob Hastings was arrested?
As to previous arrests that have taken place?
Yeah. So made inquiries, investigations as to how many arrests had happened with other UCOs or even with this officer?
Yeah, I think my priority, and I think rightly so, was to stop what had been happening for a number of years from continuing to happen. I don't think it would have necessarily been something at the time that, with regards to the proportionality of looking into those arrests, it's something that I thought about. My biggest concern, and I didn't do this, I'd left the unit by then, and it remains a concern, and this inquiry may have identified these issues, is of people who will have committed criminal offences, but because of the reporting, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to establish this, who are incited or encouraged to do criminal acts and commit criminal offences they otherwise would not have done because of SDS operatives, which is a far more serious issue, and I think your question is the one real concern I have that I didn't pursue before I left to look at. But that would have been, and this inquiry may have found, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do when records aren't accurate, they're not honest. And I'm sure many of those incidents will have been kept within the tightness of the SDS cadre and probably never written about.
This incident with HN18, did that trigger a move to close the SDS, or was this just one of a number of concerns that had a cumulative effect on your thinking?
Yeah, it's the latter. I think this was another significant issue that I felt contributed to me making the representations I did to Assistant Commissioner Peter Clark, as I said then, Head of Terrorism for the UK, the most senior police officer, for leading the national security and terrorism effort. My principal concern was the proportionality, the justification of the deployments, I have to say. I was really concerned about that. And I wasn't involved in that process. As the Detective Chief Superintendent, I didn't have a role in the authorising process. The applicant, I think, would normally have been the DCI, and the authorising officer would have been the commander. But authorising officers would have been John McDowell, would have been Peter Clark on occasions. I think they had concerns about the justification for the deployments, and that's probably one of the compelling reasons that I think persuaded Mr. Clark to support my position with regards to closing the unit down and stop all deployments.
Can we look, please, at B63, MPS 05267770, page 2. So we understand that DCI Flood and DSU McKinney responded to this arrest by having a meeting with the CPS.
Yes.
On and this notice from the 28th of the 9th, 2007.
So I've absolutely no doubt that one of the first things I would have insisted upon, I don't know if they've given it in their statements or testimony, is that we engage with the CPS around the arrest.
At page 3, the second paragraph under bullet point 4,
Yes.
it says in the last sentence, this situation had not occurred previously and will not occur in the future as systems have now been implemented to ensure this will not happen again. So this is a note that was provided to the CPS.
Right.
The suggestion that this situation hadn't occurred previously, that's not accurate, is it?
It's not accurate to my understanding.
In
Most
terms
certainly
of that being suggested to the CPS by senior officers, what do you say about that? What?
I can't give an answer to that, but arrests had previously occurred with SDS operatives that we had not engaged with the Crown Prosecution Service. On the documents you've shown me, that that's clear. So I can't explain why that reads as it does.
We understand from evidence that we've heard in the inquiry that previously arrests and even charges were seen as something that would enhance cover, that officers such as Boiling, when he was arrested as part of an RTS demonstration, would be lauded for acting professionally. Would that be something that you would agree with or not?
I wouldn't agree with it. Every case, every deployment is different. There may be times when, and I alluded to this earlier, in the operational plan there will be an arrest for reasons of the progress of the operation, the difficulty, the challenge of the network or organisation that you are seeking to get evidence about and stop from causing harm. But it would be rare and it would be well planned. None of this was well planned, and it happened, I think, far too often, and without any oversight or transparency with partners, whether that's the CPS or others, with regards to the activities of the unit. They operated an entire bubble, and it was quite hard to penetrate that bubble. I think that was the difficulty for senior officers. They accepted some of this, frankly, nonsense propaganda that was put out by the SDS about what they were doing, and simply weren't intrusive enough around the reality of what the unit were doing.
Can I just clarify, was DAC Clark informed about this? And
well, I know I spoke to DAC Clark. I can't give you a date or what I said, but when I presented him with a series of reasons and a rationale as to why I was making the decision I'd made, I spoke to DCI Flood and Detective Superintendent McKinney. I think they were still trying to actually change the unit to, which was the original intention, was to transition it into something that was fit for purpose for the current threats. There was the authorisations that I thought were unwarranted and disproportionate and unjustified. There was obviously and I'll call it the activity, the modus operandi with regards to the arrest and the relaxed attitude to that arrest. And there was the reality that this wasn't addressing this unit, the threats that we were facing with regards to national security now. So for those reasons and others, I set out a list at, I think it's paragraph 612 of my statement. I'm as confident as I can be that that reflects the document that I put in front of Mr. Clark, which hasn't been made available to me. I don't think it's been found.
We can confirm we've searched for that and we can't find that document. That you're referring to the general registration docket.
There was a general registry docket, and it was about the SDS. It was a combination of lots of different reports, and I did a report onto that docket, setting out a number of the concerns that I had with regards to the SDS. The rationale, I remember bullet pointing them, the rationale for closing the unit down forthwith and stopping all the deployments. And rightfully, Mr. Clark, when I talked to him about those issues, who was very appraised of what had been happening with the SDS, he had concerns that he'd raised with me, and we'd had a number of conversations in the past. He was actually doing, I think, what others hadn't done, in fairness, in making sure there was proper scrutiny of the unit. And he tested me as to the risks of closing the unit down, the coverage, public order. Would this negatively impact on us being able to keep London safe? And I went through my rationale as to my very strong position on all of those issues. And once he was satisfied, and he was doing his due diligence very properly, he agreed that we close the unit down. Ultimately, it's his decision.
So it was his decision, but based on your rationale, effectively.
Yeah.
And is it right that, we're going off on a bit of a tangent at the moment, but in terms of making that decision, did you speak with other assistant commissioners as well? Was Cressida Dick involved in that decision making?
No, Cress spoke to me. I think she'd heard that the SDS was closing down, and they were very good at seeking to influence people. I think basically she'd been told that this would be a bad thing, and rightfully, I have a huge amount of time for Cress.
But by who? Can I ask by who she'd been told that?
I don't know. I really don't know. But she asked to see me and questioned, I suppose, rightfully, legitimately, the position, because she had probably had lots of reports with positive information about the SDS, and I explained the position, the accurate position, and I think, as far as I'm aware, she was happy with that.
Coming back to this arrest, and I just want to ask one last question, if I may, in relation to the arrest of Robert Hastings, before we go to lunch. Behind tab B70, MPS 007 6348 is an intelligence report from the 10th of October 2007 in relation to the state of emergency reaction to the dicey arrests. So this is a report from HN18, and as we can see at page 1, paragraphs 2 and 3, the reporting relates to hang on, I've got the right report. Yeah, 007 6348, sorry. Yes, this is the report from the 10th of October 2007, reporting on the legal proceedings, court dealings arising from the arrest in September.
Yes.
I'll give you a moment just to refresh your memory in relation to that. If we can have page 2 up as well.
Thank you.
It's a long document. I don't propose that we look at it in any real detail, but what you can see scanning over it is that it goes into considerable detail about those legal proceedings.
Yes, at the bottom of page 1, and then
If we can
yeah,
carry on over to page 3 as well, please. The second paragraph is what I'd like to draw your attention to. Sorry, on page 3. We see on line 8 of that second paragraph. It talks about the representatives from a firm of solicitors and their advice as to what to do during interview. And the penultimate sentence is about a prospective legal action against the police.
yeah.
Given your interest in this case, did you read this intelligence report from HN18?
I'm sorry, I have no recollection of this.
Had you raised any concerns about legal reporting, LPP, with the officers or the officer and his managers?
So I don't recall in this specific case having that conversation with regards to this arrest. What I would say is that DCI Flood and Detective Superintendent McKinney were very alive to the lack of understanding around issues such as legally privileged material, around collateral intrusion, around people who would come in within a specialist category, whether it's journalists or even, politicians and people of note in civic society. And I'm confident, because of conversations we had, were educating, helping, informing the operatives of the need to understand about these issues. And that's one of the reasons, and I did the NUTAC course many years ago, and that would have progressed. And we're in a much, much more advanced position now with the licensing of undercover officers and undercover units, where these issues are at the forefront of everybody's thinking, from the operative through the cover officer, the applicant to the authorising officer. That mindset, that thinking just didn't exist in the SDS.
Given that this was a report, though, that was made under the management of DCI Flood,
Yeah.
are you surprised to see this sort of report being made at that time? And if you haven't seen it, are you surprised that you hadn't seen it? Should it have been flagged to the more senior officers, given the nature of the LPP material and the reporting about legal proceedings?
So to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of this. I don't know if DCI Flood would have been aware of this. So it's difficult for me to answer that question. What I can assure you in this inquiry about is that DCI Flood and Superintendent McKinney were very, very, very much invested in making sure that the operatives and the cover officers, and indeed the management, the DI within the unit, were far more conscious of these issues generally. And that was the part of the decision. And again, it's the accumulative, part of the accumulative issues that caused me to arrive at the decision to shut the unit down, that the operatives, other than I think one, said that they wouldn't go on the NUTAC course, where a lot of this legal instruction and training was provided.
Sir, I've got half an eye on the time. I've got 2 more documents on this point, but we can go to that after the break.
I think probably we'd better break now, yes. Agreed. We'll resume, please, at 2:05 or as soon after as we can.